Steps. Good morning. I'm delighted to see all of you. Now, I heard when I was coming in, the big news is Jim Cantore is in town. Now, if you don't know what that means, you obviously don't watch the Weather Channel much, because if he's in town, that must mean there's about to be a weather event here. So I was very amused when somebody said, well, you know, Jim Cantore's in town. So, oh my goodness gracious. I'm delighted to be here once again, and I'm going to try to save some time at the end to talk about these books on the list. And of course, yes, for every book I put on the list, there's probably 3 that I left off, so I'm sure you all will be only too delighted to help me. I also have my email address on this, that, and the other, and I will talk about that at the end of the session today. But I want to start back where we left off with the coming of the war. Now, I digress. Isn't this the most beautiful picture you have ever seen? I mean, wouldn't you have liked to have been? This is not in the decade of World War I. It was taken in 1906. The stalwart woman right there in the middle with the sort of suit with what I assume to be a velveteen collar, perhaps, is Louise Grundy Lindsley. For those of you who knew Margaret Warden, the equestrian reporter for the Nashville Tennessean for about 70 years, that is Miss Margaret's aunt, Aunt Louise, as she called her. And Aunt Louise supported many good causes, chief of which was getting the Panama Canal cut through, and she was very active in women's affairs. She never married, and she was asked by Luke Lea, who we are going to talk about today, to chaperone this group of ladies who had won a subscription selling contest for the Nashville Tennessean, and they had sold the most subscriptions, so they went on a trip to Europe. All of these women were given a trip to Europe. And so can you imagine what that trip to Europe? We think about the luggage. I don't guess they'll be getting theirs in the overhead compartment, will they? I just love this picture. And before Margaret Warden died, I was over at her house 2 or 3 times, and she was just the cutest little mite of a woman. And you would see her standing over here by Belmont with her hat and her white gloves on, going down to the Tennessean to file her report. I was over there several different times, and she had a little cameo of Aunt Louise on her mantle. And as her memory began to fail and she had to have attendants with her all the time, one of her attendants told me one day I was over there that she would get up in the middle of the night and talk to Aunt Louise. And so I was very touched by that. And I just like the dresses here too as well. Now, having said that, one of the things I like the most about teaching any class, it doesn't really matter, is that when people bring up things that I've never thought about, ask questions about things, and now I'm going to have this thing messed up. I touched it. All right. Things that I haven't really considered here. So I wanted to bring up 2 things that I've been asked about here in the past week, one publicly here and another one. Perhaps my factories will put an end to war sooner than your Congresses. On the day that 2 Army Corps can mutually annihilate each other in a second, all civilized nations will surely recoil with horror and disband their troops. This was well before World War I began in Europe, but this man could see the future. He saw this military buildup that was taking place. Alfred Nobel. And his claim to fame, of course, with us is the Nobel Prize, but the way that he made enough money to fund the Nobel Prize was with the invention of dynamite. And so he offered this prize for peace, and this was a quotation, he wanted to look towards peace. And Woodrow Wilson was one of the early winners of the Nobel Prize for his efforts to bring about peace as a result of the end of the war. So for the person who sent me the email about Alfred Nobel, you can see him if you take the tours in Stockholm, and if you go to Norway as well. He's still very much a presence there. This war for us does not mean the same thing that it meant for the people in Europe. For us, we really did, in fact, prosper as a result of this war. But here we have Ernest Rhys writing a poem about war, about here is just a plowman who has died. He's been accustomed to working on his farm. He could make a gate. He could dig a pit. He could plow as straight as a stone can fall. And he is dead. Again, for those of you who love poetry here, somebody was asking me about this. You just go onto your Google search engine and put in World War I poetry, and you will get probably 25 sites right there with nothing but the texts of these poems that are really, really quite beautiful and magnificent. So, as we discussed last week, President Wilson, after a series of events, finally felt that he had no choice but to go to Congress and ask Congress to declare war on Germany. But of course, because he was really a very spiritual person, and he was so caught up in the philosophical meaning of war, and in particular, all of this killing, all of these young men, now Americans, who are going to be dead as a result of sending them to Europe, he felt that when he gave his war address, he really had to raise us up to a higher plane. We Americans had to go beyond just getting in there to defeat the Kaiser and whatnot. So when he gave his war address to Congress in April of 1917, he said, "The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberties. We, Americans, have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for our sacrifices we shall freely make. But we are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and freedom of nations can make them." So he brings the war. We Americans are not just fighting because Germany invaded Belgium. We are fighting to make the world safe for democracy. And as you know, the war was in a stalemate in 1917 when we entered the war. And we entered the war to make the world safe for democracy. All of these things we talked about last week had transpired. There had just been one reason after another, but to make the world safe for democracy, that sort of overrode all of these other things that had happened. Some were not quite as positive about it as President Wilson was. There were some votes. 6 senators and 50 members of the House of Representatives voted against declaring war on Germany. Senator George Norris, who actually was not from Tennessee, but he got a dam in our state named for him because of his support of the TVA, said, "We're going to war upon the command of gold. We're about to put a $sign on the American flag." So even though he was a Democrat, he did not necessarily see eye to eye on this subject with President Wilson. Wilson is a progressive. He sees using scientific principles to make the world better, the country better, and so he will immediately appoint a war council, a sort of a war cabinet, to try to manage the war in scientific ways and using various scientific methods. Now, the person on this, besides Woodrow Wilson in the center, that I think you'll probably recognize is this man right here, young Herbert Hoover. But these men were going to manage the industrial production of the United States. They were going to try to get the manpower into the Army, to get the armed forces recruited, and to fund this war effort, and to get us on the right track. Herbert Hoover, who had made a great deal of money in he was an engineer, but he had gone to China and had done some mining work and made money in mining. He was in charge of food. So he was one who was going to help us manage agricultural production and just producing enough food, not just for our soldiers, but for all the other soldiers. We had already been supplying food for the Allies for a good deal of time during the war. Now, this is what we Americans do best. Yes, the Germans built far better equipment. It lasted longer, both in World War I and in World War II, but we could do it quickly. And it might not have been a destroyer that was going to last 200 years, but it would get the job done, cut a few corners, get it going fast, and we could whip out the materials out of our high-producing factories across the country. And we did just that. We went to work. We brought ourselves together. Even the women who had been campaigning so strongly for the right to vote, many of those women said, okay, we'll support the war effort for now, and let's all do what we can to help us win the war. So it was Herbert Hoover that first asked people to plant victory gardens, and he also had these days of the week when you were going to take one thing out of your diet. As you see from this restaurant sign, on Tuesdays you didn't eat meat, on Wednesdays you didn't eat wheat, and on Saturdays you didn't eat pork. So Herbert Hoover comes up with a lot of ideas, and when the war ends, he will go to Europe, particularly to Belgium, to help feed the Europeans who are starving because there's been so little farming going on over there for 4 long years. Women go to work, they join the workforce. Over 1 million women in this country will join the workforce. And yes, when the war's over, they will give up those jobs. But that's really a sort of a temporary thing, because after the next World War, they're not going to go home quite so willingly. They're going to be a little bit harder pressed to get these women to go home. One of the novelties, somebody was telling me this, I did not know this until about 15 minutes ago, that it was during World War I that men finally gave up the use of a pocket watch and started using a wristwatch. And this makes perfect sense to me. I don't have any documentation of that, but you're getting ready to explode something and you don't want to yell, hey, 5, 4, 3. So you just, everybody's watches are all synced up. So wristwatches came to be used by the military. Those of you who've been in the military, feel free to refute me, but I heard it on the way into class, so it must be true, right? But this one I knew all about, daylight savings time. And it's really funny, I'd kind of forgotten about this until Tuesday of this week. I got a call at my office from a reporter from a television station in Memphis. and he was doing a story on daylight savings time. Now, if you read the papers, you all know why we're suddenly interested in daylight savings time, because one member of our General Assembly, Representative Curry Todd, has decided he's going to do something about it. So this reporter called me wanting to know the history of, and he had heard that I had actually written a paper about this, which I actually did. So we had standardized time going back to the 1880s and 90s. We had standardized time and created 24 worldwide time zones in direct response to railroads not being able to sync up their schedules. And even with standardized time, as you know, we had this terrible collision, a miscalculation here in Nashville during World War I. But the reason the United States, especially people in the South, they sure didn't want standardized time, because people in the South don't want the government telling them what to do. And this was just one more example of the government telling us what to do. In Tennessee, before we went to standardized time, we had 55 different times across the state. So you could drive to Memphis, to Bristol, and you'd have no clue what time it was. So during World War I, standard time now being official, we take that one step further and create daylight savings time, which we went off of as soon as the war was over. And the whole history of daylight savings time in Tennessee is quite entertaining, and also the history of the movement of the line from Bristol to where it is now, somewhere over there around the Cumberland Plateau. But we're going to save daylight to produce more and to keep more light in the factories. And so it was looked at. A lot of people felt that some religious people said this was contrary to the Bible. You know that verse over there in the Old Testament, thou shalt not have uniform time. They said that this was the devil's work, trying to create time zones, and daylight savings time was beyond the devil's work. It was so incredibly bad, and they felt that God wanted the time to be the sun. So there were people who disapproved, and as soon as the war was over, we got off of daylight savings time, but we did not get off of standard time. So here is Bernard Baruch, who has made lots and lots of money on Wall Street. He is managing industry. He is a very controversial figure, I suppose. The Wilson book by Scott Berg talks a lot about him and his efforts. We have told all of these German Americans and others that they are not necessarily welcome here. Take the hyphen out of your name. And so we see criticism and persecution, I suppose, of German Americans. Not so much in Tennessee, although Tennesseans talked a lot about the Germans. They talked it, but they didn't do anything about it. The Brewers were the ones who were the most pinpointed as the evil Germans. The Brewers were brewing beer, and by 1917, that was a dead horse you were beating, because we had been Tennessee was a completely dry state by the time World War I broke out in Europe, and we were dry, so there was no legal production of beer here. Now that doesn't mean what people are doing, but more likely than brewing beer, those designer beers that all these kids are manufacturing at home. You know, there's a whole industry of home beer making now, but they are probably making corn whiskey or something back in a holler somewhere in Tennessee. But that brings me to my next question that I was very puzzled about, which was, well, what about the Neuhoffs? They were here. They had a great big packing plant. So, yes, indeed, I've learned something about the Neuhoffs this week. And two things about them. Number one, a book not on my list. Please don't tell Ridley Wills that I left him off. But Ridley Wills has a very nice book called Lest We Forget. And it's about businesses and schools and other things here in Nashville that have kind of gone by the wayside. So he talked about the Neuhoff plant in his book, but there's lots of other information about the Neuhoff plant here, there, and yon. The Neuhoffs came to town. They were German butchers. They had learned how to do the cutting of meat in St. Louis, and two brothers came to Nashville to participate in the Tennessee Centennial. They came to Centennial Park in 1897. Well, now, what on earth could a butcher have to show off as an advancement in 1897 at a World's Fair if it's all about showing off progress? Boneless hams. So they came, and the boneless hams were quite well received here in Nashville, and so they decided to go into business. They incorporated by 1906. They had a very profitable butcher business. Of course, that whole part, all of Germantown got to be referred to as Butcher Town for a while, and there were several families, not just the Neuhoffs, who had butchering interests. The Worthens had butchering interests. The Jacobs had butchering interests. There were several families who had butchering interests. And you know, it's interesting to consider, you know, what you think of Germantown is that neighborhood right north of the Bicentennial Mall, right? Where the Germantown Cafe and Miraboule's is. Well, the butchering really was mostly towards the Cumberland River. All the plants were over there. Now, for an A+ in your history class here, why do you think they were on that side? Exactly. They thought nothing of dumping all of that in the river. After all, it's going to go downstream. It's going to Clarksville, so it's not our problem. Not our problem. And if you know the Cumberland River, you know that the water we drink comes out of the water upstream from where the packing plants were at the Omohundra Water Treatment Plant, a fascinating place if you've not been there. But the water comes out of the river there and is cleaned up, and then we dump our waste back in up there at Metro Center. So the Neuhoffs came to town. Apparently none of these German families were bothered at all. The Neuhoffs happened to be Catholic and joined the Church of the Assumption, but there were a lot of German Jews here in town as well. And for all of the talk, Nashville did nothing to bother these people at all. Now the Neuhoffs will ultimately sell their company to the Swift Company. One of the Neuhoffs bought parking lots here in Nashville in the 1920s and early 30s and sort of ran some parking lots, and then he moved to Dallas. They had a butcher concern out there, and eventually all of these meatpacking businesses here in Nashville have now closed. They are all now gone. Congress is doing everything to keep us from being spies, especially any Germans in the country. There was pretty much of a witch hunt. If you didn't support the war, that must mean you're a spy for the other side. Some of these acts that Congress passed much later came back it came around that these were really designed to take away Americans' rights and to let the government spy on its citizens. So something that continues to keep coming around and around and around. We draft lots of Tennesseans, but we did draft Tennesseans, but Tennesseans really enlisted in overwhelming numbers. They hadn't really gotten any chance much to participate in the Spanish-American War because it ended, the part in Cuba anyway, ended in only 4 months before we could ever get down there. So here was a war. We were going to get to go to Europe and we were going to get to fight. So this war was very popular, and even though we did draft people like country boy Alvin York, people were pretty responsive to the draft. And so we will have a tank corps to counter the German tank corps, and we will send our troops over to Europe. As I mentioned, I guess probably 2 weeks ago when I was talking about Mexico, General Pershing is recalled from Mexico, and he is given the leadership of the American Expeditionary Force to get our soldiers over there to France. So he arrives, and a small contingency of Americans arrive in the summer of 1917. Now again, I want you to look at yourself, have a mental timeline, because the bulk of the Americans will not really get over there until really the beginning of 1918, enough to begin that push. And as soon as we send millions of Americans over there, we finally do start pushing the Germans. I think the Germans knew why they did not want us in the war. Any of you know anything about this man? Albert Gleaves. He's a kind of a forgotten Tennessean, but he was one of the very most important people in the war in terms of responsibility. What was his responsibility? He was the commander of the fleet of ships that was assigned to get all of our soldiers over there and then get them back home safely from Europe. He was born in Nashville right before the Civil War. He went to the Naval Academy. He was given an assignment on a torpedo boat when the Spanish-American War broke out, but that didn't last very long. During the Spanish-American War, however, he did become friends with Theodore Roosevelt. And this is a person, sometimes we have retired naval people in these classes. Anybody retired from the U.S. Navy? Yes, you know what I'm talking about. There's a wonderful history there. Admiral Gleaves wrote several books of the quality of the books written by Theodore Roosevelt. So he was a sort of a hidden scholar there in all of this. But he was assigned to be the commander of the U.S. Naval Yard in New York City when we went to war with Germany. So he is promoted to being a rear admiral, and then when it's time to get the first American soldiers over there with General Pershing, he will be given command of this large number of ships to take them over there. Now, interesting statistics here. He made 776 crossings of the Atlantic Ocean in 1917, 18, and 19. The submarine zone, folks. Can you imagine being on one of those ships just expecting the torpedoes at any time? The total loss of life crossing the Atlantic when the United States entered the war, April 1917, till we got all our soldiers home, the total loss of life was 149 Americans. And we sent over 1 million Americans over there, so I thought that was really quite remarkable. Only 3 boats were ever directly hit by the submarine torpedoes, and the 3 boats that were hit and actually sunk were boats that were coming back from Europe without any men on them, without any soldiers going to war. So he, I think, really is a forgotten hero in Tennessee. We've put the face on World War I as Alvin York, period, and then secondarily here in Nashville we've put the face of Luke Lea on it, and so we've kind of forgotten what other Tennesseans did associated with this. So when the war is over, Tennessee will honor him very much, but places all over the country honored him. Hoboken, New Jersey presented him with a gold watch for his service, and on it was engraved, he had a watch, it said, he took them over and he brought them back. So, enough said. So, he became the commander of the Pacific Fleet after the war was over, but he retired in 1922, and all of you Navy guys and anybody else who's interested, he wrote a memoir about his life that was published after he died. I think it was published in the 80s, so you can probably find his memoir at the Nashville Public Library because it is, I am told it is very well written, and it is a very readable memoir of his career in the Navy and his life. He died in the state of Pennsylvania. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. If you go there, ask where he's buried and they'll take you out there, or they'll give you a map more likely than take you out there, but you should go see his grave. And in 1940, right on the verge of World War II, a ship was commissioned and named the USS Gleaves. So the Gleaves family, as I understand it, actually were farmers who owned, and I think still own, a significant amount of property in the Opryland Airport area. So some of you may know more about that than I do, but they were of those German Catholics, as I understand it, descent, but they lived in that sort of Donaldson area of town, and I think there's still a few Gleaves over there that are still farming as well today. The war was a great spark, boost, whatever you want to call it, to our economy. Not just the economy of the United States, but the economy of Nashville, Tennessee as well. We were excited to go into the war. We knew our cause was right, but we also knew that there was money to be made. Now, Luke Lea, he was not really trying to feather his cap by making money. He enlisted just because he thought it was right. He was ready to go to war. So we are going to see this level of patriotism, and we're also going to see at the very same time, we're going to see a lot of businesses coming out of this war far better than they went into the war being. And so as a result of that, we look at the biggest boost to our local economy as the building of the DuPont powder plant. It was quite a surprise almost, I would say, to the citizens of Nashville, even the business community, that this actually was built here, and a good bit of the groundwork was being laid right before all of Nashville's eyes, and nobody paid any attention to it. Here, the DuPont Company, which had been in business since Thomas Jefferson was President of the United States, started quietly pretty much as soon as World War I began in Germany, buying acreage in an unpopulated, relatively speaking, unpopulated bend of the Cumberland River into Hadley's Bend. Now that area, which as the crow flies is pretty close actually to the Hermitage, the area in that bend, if it was called anything at all, it was called Jacksonville. Bet you didn't know that. So that area was called Jacksonville, and they bought up this farmland with the idea that they were going to build a gunpowder plant there. And that idea was well underway when the U.S. entered the war. Meantime, the Nashville business community doesn't really know this is going on, so the Nashville business community is very vocally and working hard to promote the building of a nitrate plant down in the Muscle Shoals area, which would essentially do the same thing. The business community here felt that this would be a boost to our economy, a kind of a trickle-down effect. Muscle Shoals isn't that far from here, and there would be some exponential benefits for us as that was built. So when the DuPont company in December of 1917 announced they were going to build this plant over there in Hadley's Bend, and for those of you, I bet y'all know Betty Hadley. Some of you know Betty Hadley. Albert Hadley, her brother, was a very well-known interior designer who died last year. Betty, this is the Hadley family. Hadley's Bend was their land grant, their land claim over there in that bend of the river. So it became a complete surprise to Nashville, but immediately everybody says, gosh, this is a great idea. The Tennessean headlines early January say, watch us grow. That would be appropriate for pretty much any time in Nashville's history, in almost all of our histories here in Nashville. The commercial interests work really hard. As soon as they see what's happening, they're going to accommodate DuPont. They're going to push in any way they can to help DuPont, because if DuPont is healthy and making money, then there'll be opportunities for us to make money as well. So the commercial interests of the city push for additional lines of commuter trains going in and out of that part of town, which there weren't really commuter trains to speak of over there in that part of town. There were no commuters living over there or working over there. We see the value of real estate going up. The commercial interests are very happy to see that happen. They actively work to get a bridge built over the river. They realize that they can supply services to the DuPont plant. And we see even the money that this is going to generate. These people who are getting a paycheck from DuPont are going to turn around and spend that paycheck. So it's going to be lots of money going into our economy in a variety of different ways. So the downtown stores in downtown Nashville actually started extending their hours. They started being open later. You know, they always closed at, 5:30 or 6 o'clock. There was no such thing as a store being open till 9 in those days. They extended their hours to accommodate the workers at the powder plant, the residents of DuPont. Now, there was some kind of unintended and unexpected fallout from this, because they were offering high wages. Oh, let me tell you what the high wages were. Higher than other jobs here in town. $2.75 to $3, not an hour, per 8-hour day. That was a high paycheck. An 8-hour day. Far higher than any place else offered in the city. Nobody else was offering that. And so, of course, the people who are making the lowest salaries, women and African Americans, race out there to take these jobs. And, of course, that meant for some folks, their household help was not going to work for 50 cents a day when they could have $2.75 a day. So clerks in the stores left their job, people's domestic help left their jobs, and found jobs in Old Hickory. They estimate that 5,000 African American men and 10,000 women went to work at DuPont as a result of this. There was a great deal of interest in this plant, and it brings people into our city, not only to work at the plant, but they come in from the outside to work at the plant. They're not employing just Nashvillians. There's enough jobs to recruit from outside the boundaries of Nashville. Lots and lots of women who worked at the DuPont plant. So many women that worked at the DuPont plant, and they lived at the YWCA both downtown, and there was a YWCA and a YMCA in what you and I call Old Hickory for a while as well. But these women and for that matter the men as well who worked out there, the women needed especially protection, and they needed kind of a dorm mother. So Lucretia Owen is, guess where she's from, Mr. Covington? Paris, Tennessee. She is the social worker that DuPont hires to make sure these women working at the powder plant are cared for properly. And she becomes the social worker out there. She's really quite an interesting woman. And she kept a journal. So we've got her account of what happened. One of the things that she described in her journal was that many of the workers who came to the DuPont plant were actually kids that had run away from home. You know, you're 16, 17 years old. You want to try life out, so just leave home. You can have that joy of independence. And so many of these workers, these young ones, were just kids who were looking for a sense of adventure. Now, what also happened, of course, is with this population getting so growing so rapidly, you're going to have some examples of violence. You're going to have a little lawlessness here and there, and so you're going to have a little more police protection and rules than you might think you might have. So the plant, it really is, it is a boom to the economy, even though by the time they really got the thing up and running, the war was pretty much over. So Nashville recognized when the plant did open that the real secret here, the challenge for us as a city, was to keep this plant open, to keep DuPont here in this Davidson County area after the war ended. DuPont came in, and it was a company town over there. They built houses for their workers. They provided everything you needed. They built a country club for their management to be able to play golf. They did everything under the sun for their workers over there, and we certainly didn't want all these houses that had been built emptied as soon as the war was over and there was not a market, a demand for smokeless gunpowder. Now, if any of you have not been to Old Hickory lately, you ought to go. About once a year they will have one of those open house Sundays, and they have some tours, and a lot of the young people, a lot of kind of hipsters have bought these little houses and have fixed them up, and so it's quite a trendy little place to live over there in what you and I call Old Hickory today. So when you hear of one of those pilgrimages, it's great fun to see what these houses over there actually looked at. The higher your paycheck, the bigger your house, of course. But it was a company town. And did you know that Nashville became known as the Powder City of the world? See, we can add that. We can add that to our list of nicknames. Music City, the Wall Street of the South, the Buckle of the Bible Belt, the Southern Vatican, the Athens of the South, Rock City. We are Rock City, you know that, not that place up on Lookout Mountain. We are Rock City. Well, we're for a while anyway, the Powder City of the world. So imagine that. So when we get over there, those lines start moving. The Germans tried one last gasp in 1918. And, I mean, there were a couple of different times that Kaiser Wilhelm and his generals considered trying to end the war. But it's going to take a little while for him to get to that position. But our arrival is definitely good news for the Allies. So with us arriving, and this, let me go back to this line. I know that I click these PowerPoints erratically. It's because my brain and hand don't work at the same level. President Wilson, once again, he has this moral certitude about him. God has put him in the White House for a reason, and it is up to him. The burden of the world peace is on his shoulders as he sees it. He has this special anointing. So now with us clearly beginning to help win the war, he is looking to how we can keep this from ever happening again. So in January of 1918, he goes to Congress and gives a talk that will be to Congress about the world. His talk was to Congress, almost like a State of the Union address, but it is really not directed at the American congressman, because there's nothing in this that an American congressman is going to vote on except for one thing. And so it's really the microphone of the world that he is speaking to when he gives his 14 points address. This is how the peace is going to be. I'm the school teacher. I know what's right for the whole world. Listen to me, Germany. Listen to me, France. Listen to me, everybody. And so he comes up with his points. You can go online and read them. It's really quite a short little document. It doesn't take much time to read this at all. 14 guidelines for how we're going to look at the world after this war ends, which it will any day now. Several of these guidelines deal with specific territorial problems. Germany had taken Alsace-Lorraine from France in 1871. Poland hadn't existed since Napoleon. We're going to put Poland back on the map. Several things about territory are spelled out. And then he also has these principles that he is basing all of this on. This is a man who has this moral compass that he is using. So let's spend a minute here and talk about what he was trying to accomplish. And I think as much as anything, when he sat down and wrote this speech, he was looking at why, when the Germans had defeated the French very decisively in this Franco-Prussian War in 1871, why had this war broken out 30-something years later? So it was because of the way the peace had been handled between France and Germany. So first and foremost, he says, we cannot treat Germany like Germany treated France. That is what he is saying there. He wants all of these resentments to be gone. You know, the resentments, the French had been, that wound about losing Alsace-Lorraine had been festering since 1871. They were mad about that. So Germany is not going to be stripped of any territory that they rightly own. In other words, we're not going down there to Africa and take away all your colonies down there. But Alsace-Lorraine, that's another matter because you took it from France. Now, along with this treating them fairly, is we will not allow Germany to be required to pay any reparations. Now, all of you who know enough about World War I from other places know that that became the big deal because they ended up being saddled with reparations. But again, Germany had forced France to pay reparations in 1871, so Germany we could consider that the French wanted to get back at the Germans, which, as it turned out, proved to be true. But Wilson thought everybody would listen to him, and we will treat the Germans fairly with respect. Principle number 2, the boundaries of all European countries are going to be by nationality and language. So we're not just going to draw lines on maps to cover square miles there. Wilson thought that the aspirations of people a la the Serbs to govern themselves had been a major cause of this war. And of course he avoided mentioning all of the ways that the European nations had carved up Africa. So he didn't get around to any of that. But he said that Europe is going to have these lines that are based on nationality and language. So of course that means Poland, you're going to get your country back. You're going to become a country again. Another thing that he said was one of the important things, absolute, complete freedom of the seas. Now that was directed at the U-boats, the Lusitania being blown up, all of the German involvement in interfering with Great Britain's shipping. So we're not going to allow that to happen anymore. We will have absolute freedom of the seas. We are all going to give up our weaponry. We had had this enormous arms buildup for 20 years before this war. France and Germany had stockpiled big piles of weaponry. And that was, in Wilson's opinion, one of the causes of the war. I'm looking around here. I don't see Terry Cohen right at this moment, but I see there's some people, some of you I see at movies quite regularly on Friday night, and the Cohens are probably the people I see the most at the movies on Friday night. But there was a Sherlock Holmes movie 4 or 5 years ago that really hit on this arms trade, the arms buildup. This doesn't work. People just don't want to give up their guns, right? You've heard that before? And whether it's a country or an individual. And finally, he's going to prevent war from ever happening again, because he is going to get all the nations to sign an agreement that any disputes, such as Serbia national assassinating heir to the throne of Austria, any disputes will be settled by a Congress of Nations, a General Assembly, a League of Nations. And this will end war as we know it. So this is Wilson's 14 points. It is in every newspaper in the world. It is looked upon. It is read. It is studied. And this really is on the table when the beginning of the end comes, which is in January of 1918. The Germans are beginning to be worn down. The American men over there are beginning to make a huge difference on the front. We are beginning to be able to effectively get supplies to the front. And we have our own machine guns in addition to compete with the German machine guns that they have used so effectively on us. Here is an African American unit who were fighting in Germany, in France, and then ultimately going into Germany during this period of time. There are lots and lots of photographs from this war you can see. And finally, we will get ourselves in the national spotlight because of Alvin York. Country boy from Pall Mall, Tennessee. I'm sure there's somebody in this room besides me who's been to Pall Mall, but it's hard to get there, wouldn't you agree? I know, a life ago, but the roads haven't improved a bit. I can assure you, they have not improved. It is some of the most beautiful country you'll ever see. I mean, hills, beautiful views, but oh my goodness, it is isolated up there at Pall Mall. He became our hero. He will have a great act of heroism where he will capture a German machine gunner's nest, take a lot of Germans prisoner, kill a few Germans, but take over 100 as prisoner. And if you want to see this, and this is actually quite entertaining, you should go on YouTube, because during World War II, Hollywood decided to make a movie about Alvin York with Gary Cooper, who won the Academy Award for his male actor for his portrayal of York, plays Alvin York. So don't copy this down, just go onto YouTube and put in Alvin York movie, and you can watch the whole movie on your computer. If you can do that, you're a better person than I am. But I can't sit there and watch it, period. But it's actually quite entertaining. Now, of course, as you know, I certainly don't have an accent, but they portray the Tennessee accent. It's awful. It's terrible. Gary Cooper speaking hillbilly is not a beautiful thing for your ears. These old machine guns, you know, they didn't have a swivel on them, so they were on this tripod, and so in order to move, to aim, if you're aiming over here, to aim over here, you got to pick the whole darn thing up and set it down again. So, but this was technology, and this was killing lots of allies, and when we came over there with ours, they killed lots of Germans. Now, as you know, Alvin York is such a state and national hero that we have honored him by putting a statue of him on the southeast corner of the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol. This was put up, I guess, in the 50s, maybe. Anybody remember going to that dedication? I don't. But it's been down there for a while. Well, the NRA, you all know what that stands for, National Rifle Association, came to town 10, 15 years ago for their convention. So they go over to pay tribute to Sergeant York, and guess what? That's a World War II gun he's holding. Wrong gun. Wrong gun. Now, I mentioned this in my college class one day, and this was the most interesting thing I'd said all year to my college students. In gracious and growing Gallatin, you know who I'm talking about, that they went and researched this, and they brought me all the information about the kind of gun he had, the kind of gun this was, and of course I've promptly forgotten it. I can't tell you except that this is not the type of gun that Sergeant York himself had. So as a result, I mean, his exploits are late September and October of 1918, and we're going to have peace November 11th, 11/11/18, 11 o'clock a.m., 11/11/18 a.m. We are going to have peace, and the celebrations will begin all over Western Europe, all over the United States as well. We are excited to be at peace. I copied these charts. I thought you all might find some of this interesting. The statistics, if you're really interested in this, when you get the piece of paper with my email address on it, you can email me and I'll send you these statistics. There are statistics all over the internet you can look up. But look at the number of forces that were mobilized by Russia, 12 million men. Look at the casualty tolls, and look at our number of soldiers killed, 116,000, 204,000 wounded. oh my goodness, what a bloodbath this was for all the nations of Europe. What a terrible bloodbath. And you look here at the United States numbers here, these are just U.S. war casualties from all of these wars, and look at the number of actual battle deaths, 53,000. Of course, you know, we can say, well, only 53,000 died. But, you know, Stalin said, if one person is killed in war, it's a terrible tragedy. If 1 million are killed, it's just a statistic. And, you know, if it's your son or your brother or your husband that's killed in this war, it's considerably more than just a statistic. And so there were Americans killed. We had many, not many, I'll show you a list of them in a minute. The Gold Star Mothers here in Tennessee, Tennesseans did die in this war. But for the moment, it is party time, and Wilson is very pleased because Germany has said in its surrender the Kaiser had already stepped down and had fled the country. Woodrow Wilson said that, the German officials who surrendered, it's not a surrender, and I do a great injustice to what happened if I call it a surrender. The Germans said they would cease fighting if the peace were to be based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Now that's the point I want to make. This was not a surrender, it was a ceasefire. An armistice is a cessation of fighting, not a surrender. So the Germans, when they did cease fighting, said, we will do this based on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the plans for the reorganization of Europe that were spelled out by Woodrow Wilson in this message to Congress. But even though they just agreed to cease fighting, people heard what they wanted to hear, which is they're surrendering. And they did not surrender. They signed an armistice, and they just agreed to cease fighting. So Woodrow Wilson is excited beyond belief. I mean, this just really reinforces what he's felt about himself, that he has been called to bring about the peace. I'm sure some of you memorized this poem when you were in school. We memorized this poem out there in Texas. You can go to Flanders Field in Belgium and see the poppies row on row when they plant them there, and you can tour this cemetery. There's a lot of things you can actually tour in little tiny Belgium. Woodrow Wilson is the big name everywhere, not just the United States, but all over the world. He's asked to throw out balls at ball games. What he doesn't really understand is they're applauding him, but what they're really applauding is the war ending, period. He hears all of that applause as, they love me, they love me. And that was not exactly what happened. So he announces very quickly he's going to Paris himself as President of the United States to personally oversee the peace conference so that he can make sure they do exactly what he tells them to do. So he goes to Europe and he's welcomed as a hero, but again, it's really not about Wilson. It's more about my son's that's still alive is not going to be killed. You know, it's much more to that point. No more of our neighbors are going to be sent to this bloodbath in the trenches. So they are celebrating with great vigor, but Wilson interprets all of this very differently. And so when they get to the conference, this is where Wilson's hopes are almost immediately dashed. Again, I refer to that Scott Berg book about Wilson. It is really powerful when he discusses what happened at that conference, because Wilson just was beyond just being shocked. he just couldn't believe it. And he started he had always had hypertension, he had always had some blood pressure issues, and now he starts having these headaches. And we really believe that he started having these little mini strokes right there in Paris. There were several occasions when he would have to stay in his room for 3 or 4 days at a time. There was, within his innermost circle, there was some concern for his mental health, and they were quite worried about them. But the fact of the matter is, the Allies absolutely were determined that Germany was going to pay. First and foremost, it was the French. They hadn't forgotten 1871, and they weren't going to forget it. Now they were going to make sure that Germany paid. Both reparations and anything else they figured they could take away from Germany. So they did agree, the nations of Europe did agree to join this League of Nations, but here in the United States, Wilson could agree to it, but the United States president cannot sign a treaty and have it become law. In the United States, a treaty must be ratified by a vote of the United States Senate. And that's where Wilson's dreams began to fall apart. He was so convinced that everybody wanted him there, but chief of which was the Almighty, that he did not see any political opportunity, I should say, with the next election, which would be 1920. He didn't see any political opportunity to join hands with the Republicans, chief of which was Henry Cabot Lodge, and say, let's all do this together. So he doesn't take a single Republican with him. And that turned out to be a terrible, terrible mistake on Wilson's part. So when he got back home, and this treaty is out there for Congress to sign, for the Senate to vote on, so that we can have an agreement on this treaty, Lodge just flatly says no, and he's got the votes to back him up, and he can stall it. So Wilson, who was a very fine public speaker, very eloquent speaker, says, okay, I'm taking my case to the country. And he embarks upon this exhaustingly long train campaign whereby he stopped at city after city giving speeches multiple times a day in support of the 14 points, thinking, I'm going to get the people to support it, and then their senators will have no choice but to support it. And he launches this campaign, and it is that during this campaign in September that he has what we now know as a stroke. He got back to the White House and has a more massive stroke, but this is the part of the story that many of you do know. Nobody except his wife and doctor saw him for many, many months. That could not happen today, but it certainly happened then. Anything that needed to be signed was given to Edith, and she would take it in. He was, for the rest of his life, he died in 1924. One side of his body was completely paralyzed. We had no idea the condition of the president, but above all, he was a broken man. Apart from the stroke, this losing the League of Nations broke him down in every way. So the map of Europe will be sort of worked on. There's the ethnic map of Europe. You'll see the Poles getting their country back. You see Czechoslovakia there, Austria and Hungary divided. Yugoslavia there, the Slavic nation. Now let me just go back. You see, there is the map before the war, and here is the map after the war. Again, I can send you these maps by email if you're really interested. And I love to look at maps, so I realize that I'm kind of moving through these maps very rapidly. So for Wilson, the defeat of the League of Nations was the final blow. He was seen out in public a few more times late in his administration. When he went out of office, he and his wife bought a house not too far from DuPont Circle, if you all know Washington, D.C., Embassy Row, and he lived there for the remainder of his life. But he was a broken man. Now, that is how World War I ends, and you all know that because Wilson's dreams weren't realized, because the Germans were forced to pay reparations and to England and France, and then England and France, who did they owe money to? The United States bankers. So the United States bankers were collecting money from England and France and then turning around and loaning to Germany so that Germany could stay on its feet and then pay France and England reparations, who could then pay us. The circle goes into a tailspin, and when Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany and says, we're not paying any more of those reparations, things began to come undone again. Now, I want to make three last words here. It is in the summer of 1918 that the worst train accident in American history takes place in the Dutchman's Curve of the railroad over in Belmead. Today it is behind St. Thomas Hospital. You can see the exact spot. Due to one train being late and the signals getting crossed, two trains hit head-on, and over 100 people were killed. It was absolutely something that was horrendous. The death toll, the injuries in this wreck, the train coming into town were carrying workers to the DuPont plant to work. So that was one of these casualties that took place here. And I want to say that at the time the Armistice was signed in November 1918, Nashville was more concerned about the Spanish flu than we really were the end of the war. I think partly because we knew the end of the war was coming. It was just a matter of time as to when it came. And so here comes this Spanish flu, which we could talk an entire hour about it. But it really, of course, spread where people lived in close proximity to each other. It's called the Spanish flu because it was first identified in Spain. American soldiers brought it to a military base in Kansas, then it went to Philadelphia, and then it spread where people are living close to each other. So with young workers at the DuPont plant living in barracks out there in Old Hickory, the casualty toll in Old Hickory was incredibly high. It spread across the state of Tennessee. By October, headlines of the Tennessean said city hospitals full, 50 calls turned down. October 4th, quarantine is deemed useless. They can't protect anybody by quarantining them from getting the flu. October 7th, drastic action is taken to check the disease spread. Question stopping of local schools is now being considered. And they did actually close schools here for about a week. And the mayor sent word to the ministers of all the churches to call off worship services. And there was at least 1 week that our church did not have, those of you who go to church with me, did not have worship because of the flu epidemic. So we are doing everything we can to keep the spread, but it seems that nothing we are doing is stopping the hysteria associated with it. This is a particularly disturbing strain of contagious disease because it spreads the people who are most vulnerable are the people in their prime of life, people in their 20s and 30s, the ones working at DuPont. It doesn't seem to hit old people and young people like the measles and the mumps and those other epidemics did. So it doesn't really start abating until almost the end of October. And we are still in flu mode when the Armistice takes place here in November. We are still very, very focused. Nashville had 429 deaths. That's the city of. Old Hickory, Jacksonville, the powder plant. You know, there was a place out there called Rayon City for a while. 465 deaths in Old Hickory. Old Hickory was affected the worst. There were Mexican workers who had been brought in to work at the powder plant, and that was the worst of the worst of the worst. And so I guess the only thing to come out of this flu epidemic was that the people who study infectious diseases learned a great deal from this and went on to be able to diagnose strains of the flu. So that is on our minds here. And then while Wilson's in Europe, Congress finally got around to passing a bill for the ratification of an amendment giving women the right to vote. So as happened here in Nashville, Tennessee, once again, in August of 1920, Tennessee will become the 36th and final state to ratify the suffrage amendment giving women the right to vote. And that too is another one of these tales that I have spent hours talking about, but we'll have to save that one for another day. And I do want to tell you this. It hasn't been exactly scheduled yet, but I am going to do, next month is a Women's History Month, I'm going to do a Women's History, How Women Got the Right to Vote lecture for Metro. It'll be totally free. The doors are open to anybody, but it will be in Miss Cheap's column or somewhere in the newspapers when this gets scheduled. And it's actually a fun story. I know there are a lot of y'all that have heard me tell this probably 20 times, but it's a good story. And so I welcome you to come, and I will send, if Norma can send out an email, I won't be competing with Osher. It will be at a time different from this, but it will most likely be at the Sunny West Conference Center, which is down behind the old Howard School building. But I'll send Norma all of that. Now, this is in the interest of, I used to not do this, but this is shameless self-promotion. I'm the county historian, and I have embarked on a big project with a lot of other people. Some of you already know about this and are involved. We are in the midst of producing a Davidson County encyclopedia, which will be online. Don't jump out of your skin. It won't be Wikipedia. John Siegenthaler is the executive editor of this operation. All articles will be signed, but there are some flyers out there about this project with my name on it. And if you would like to write one article, I'm not asking you, they're 250 words, some of these articles, a little entry. We'd love to have your help. There is some email, there's 2 email addresses, and you can just email for more information, topics available. But I would encourage you, I am now on Thursday afternoons keeping office hours in the Nashville room of the Public Library. So if you will come down there, I will hold your hand and help you with it. But we want to have, we're trying to, my goal is 250 local people. It's all volunteers. Nobody's getting paid to do anything associated with this. So we really would love to have any of you participate in that. There's a flyer out there, and send me an email, and I'll be glad to tell you what I know. And as I always say, I love doing these classes. I do love to see you all at the grocery store, at the movies. I love doing all of this. You know that I have many challenges, one of which is I don't know how to use a phone. And you are welcome. You are welcome to call me. If I answer the phone, I'm as apt to talk to you for 30 minutes, probably more apt than some chores at home. But I will be delighted to talk to you. But please, the one thing I ask is don't leave me a message and ask me to call you back, because I'm just honest. I can't return phone calls, and I get a lot of calls at home. So I'm happy to talk to you if you get me. And you can get me. I mean, I actually, if you sat out there in front of my house and you were a criminal, you'd see I have very regular habits. I really love teaching these classes. You can email me at any point. You can email me with books you like, books you don't like. Thank you so very much for your attention.